I welcome you to the Smithsonian American Art Museum's 33rd Annual Charles Eldredge Prize Lecture. Let me begin by gratefully acknowledging the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here in Washington, D.C., and the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we are gathered. I also want to recognize the labor of people who were enslaved in constructing the museum's historic buildings, the old patent office, and the Renwick Gallery. The Eldredge Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in American Art is awarded annually in honor of my predecessor and a distinguished scholar himself, Charles C. Eldredge, who served as the Smithsonian American Art Museum's director from 1982 to 1988. During his tenure, he promoted scholarship through many channels, from exhibitions to our fellowship program and to the American Art Journal, which he founded in 1987. We're grateful to the museum's American Art Forum, that's our patrons group, which supports the funding of the Eldredge Prize most generously. You might ask, what does it take to receive this award? The Eldredge Prize recognizes originality and thoroughness of research and excellence of writing, as well as clarity of method. It's bestowed on the author of a recent book-length publication that provides insights into works of art, the artists themselves, or aspects of history and theory that enrich our understanding of America's artistic heritage. Before the speaker is introduced, I'd like to take a moment to thank the distinguished jurists, the three individuals who helped select the winner from among over 24 nominated texts. The jurors were Elizabeth Hutchinson, an associate professor of American art history at Barnard College, Columbia University; Nizan Shaked, professor of contemporary art history, museum and curatorial studies at California State University, Long Beach, and herself a winner of the annual Eldredge Prize but 2 years ago; and Paul Stati, professor of fine arts on the Alumni Foundation at Mount Holyoke College. This year, the jury selected Cherise Smith to be the winner of the Eldredge Prize for her book, Michael Ray Charles, A Retrospective, published in 2020 by the University of Texas Press. Smith will next be introduced by my colleague, Robin Veeder, who serves as executive editor of the American Art Journal.
Thank you. Hello to our audiences at the GRI and SAAM. We're delighted to be together for this live recording. Thank you very much to the Getty for hosting us. Dr. Cherise Smith is the Joseph D. Jamail Chair in African American Studies and Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies and Art History at the University of Texas at Austin. She's also the founding executive director of the university's art galleries at Black Studies, where she spearheads the Black Studies Art and Archive Initiative. Smith completed a PhD in art history at Stanford University in 2005. She's worked in curatorial departments of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the St. Louis Art Museum, among other institutions. Her research has been supported by the Getty Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African American Research at Harvard University. In addition to the book we recognize today, Smith has authored Enacting Others, Politics of Identity in Eleanor Anton, Nikki S. Lee, Adrian Piper, and Anna DeVere Smith, published by Duke University Press in 2011. And she has published essays in Art Journal, American Art, and Exposure, among other venues. She further shapes the field through her service on editorial boards of American Art, thank you, Art Journal, and the Archives of American Art Journal. You can see we're very grateful to Cherise. This year, Smith is an inaugural resident scholar of the African American Art History Research Initiative at the Getty Research Institute. Her project, titled Healing Old Wounds, explores how the contemporary artists Carrie Mae Weems, Charles Gaines, Rodney McMillan, and Colleen Smith use appropriation and conceptualism to explore traumatic events from the American past. The jurors awarded the 2021 Eldredge Prize to Dr. Smith for her book, Michael Ray Charles, A Retrospective. In their letter of commendation, from which I will quote at length, Stady, Shaked, and Hutchinson praised Smith for producing a comprehensive, richly illustrated, deeply researched chronicle of an important artist whose work confronts the viewer with difficult materials, found images, and objects depicting the sordid tradition of American minstrelsy. The jury was impressed with Smith's detailed analysis of the artworks, the clear presentation of complex theoretical ideas, and her elegant writing style. Both the topic of this book and its format push forward a vital contemporary discussion about how art and culture can engage critically with a painful history of racism. The jury further comments, the artist's appropriation of stereotypes has been controversial, yet Smith carefully demonstrates the ways in which his work distances caricatures that demean human beings from the actual people and communities who were subject to the violence of such images. She expertly unpacks complex discourses, laying out the terms and stakes of various and often conflicting positions, as seen in her discussion of the simultaneous existence of invisibility and hypervisibility, or the distinction between parody and irony. Her historical overview of contemptible collectibles leads to a brilliant analysis of the contradictory use of satire in visual art. They continue. Demonstrating the social and political significance of the work and its sophistication, Smith positions Charles alongside other contemporary artists from across the country who have dealt with such materials. She especially highlights how the artist engages critically with pop traditions and commercial mass culture. Neither the artist nor the art historian shy away from tackling the lasting legacies of racial violence in our society. Both insist on the need to oppose its existence in the present. Significantly, the book itself reproduces several of these well-worn contemptible images, restaging for the reader the enduring, pervasive presence of demeaning caricature in our contemporary experiences. We, I'm still quoting the jury, found it especially compelling that the book is the product of extensive discussions between a historian and an artist. Its collaborative format offers a model for researching and writing the history of contemporary art. The jury also greatly appreciates that the book opens with a transcript of a public conversation with the artist about racial masquerade. This demonstrates right from the beginning that all of us are implicated in the task of facing the legacy of racial representation. In both the timeliness and timelessness of its themes, Michael Ray Charles, A Retrospective, offers not only a critical reflection on the past, but also a powerful exploration of the debate about how to process historical imagery in the present. In her lecture today, Smith will address the methodology of her prize-winning book by speaking about the art historian's toolkit and Michael Ray Charles. One final technical note, I ask that our virtual audience members leave their cameras and microphones off during the speaker's presentation to enable the best view for all participants. We will have a Q&A at the end of this lecture. Thank you very much.
Afternoon, everyone. So in a Black Studies department, you would speak back to me. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Smithsonian American Museum for inviting me to present on my book, Michael Ray Charles, A Retrospective, and the Getty Research Institute and its staff for hosting the presentation. I'd also like to thank the jury of the Eldredge Prize for recognizing the value of my writing and analyses about Charles's work and honoring it with the award. Thanks to family and friends for coming out and supporting the writing of this book, which was no small feat, and my fellow scholars who wished me well today. Thank you. It's a remarkable achievement because it's the first time a book on African American art has garnered the award, and only the second book in the prize's history to center on contemporary art. To say that differently, it's the first Eldredge Prize book to focus on a Black artist who is living, who is in a stage of life where he might benefit from knowledge produced around his work. That is no small thing. Thinking about Charles's achievement in being a Black artist who is fortunate enough to be the subject of a major research project, I inevitably turn to my colleagues and my own experiences in art history. These have something in common with Charles's experiences in the art world. I think back to my time at Stanford University in the heady days when Wanda Corn created something akin to an Americanist think tank with 2 faculty dedicated to the area, a visiting professor program that hosted Brian Wolfe, Sarah Burns, and David Lubin, among others, and generous funding packages for graduate students. I went there to study American art. During my time in the program, I realized my interest was American art and race, and American art by Black people in particular, but not exclusively. There were no faculty who focused on African American art or racialization, so I found Arnold Rampersad in English and Harry Elam in theater and dance to advise me on these areas. In my home department, I was told by one professor that I had, quote, a good command of grammar, but not much facility with sentences. In another instance, I learned that in the faculty's annual review of grad students, faculty members remarked that I was only interested in Black art. I had the presence of mind to respond that one faculty member was only interested in male painters in 1860s France, and that another was focused on a group of artists who crossed the Atlantic in the 1920s and so on. To her credit, my advisor peered out from behind her round glasses, smiled, and said, "You've got a good point, Cherise." So let me take this opportunity to acknowledge the honor of following in Wanda Corn's footsteps, in my advisor's footsteps, in winning the Eldredge Prize. Her book, The Great American Thing, won in, I think it's 2002. That book remains for me the gold standard in its close reading and clear writing. These microaggressions would continue when I joined art history at the University of Texas at Austin. As the first person of color to earn tenure in art history there, I was told by a colleague that I didn't really do art history. "You're really a cultural historian," she announced. Years later, another colleague denigrated this very book as a, quote, inside job because I happened to know the artist. And here at the white travertine and limestone Acropolis from which I currently speak, would-be gatekeepers question my art historical bona fides and characterize my field as unfamiliar. Now, I mention these experiences to point out the challenges that the field of art history continues to have in making space for certain art, particular artists, and the art historians who produce knowledge about them. These sundry examples demonstrate art history's continued dependence on pillars of whiteness. Let me quote my esteemed colleague and friend, Eddie Chambers, who, in his Small Acts article, The Difficulty of Naming White Things, put the problem succinctly. It seemed to me there were things, and then there were Black things. There was history, and then there was Black history. There was art, and then there was Black art. Simply put, white people didn't need to prefix their stuff as white art, white history, white memorabilia, because history, art, memorabilia, and a host of other things carried with them in the single unracialized or deracialized word, abundant references to, and presumptions of whiteness and white people. Time and again, I find myself returning to the knotty question of the difficulty of naming white things, and by extension, the pitfalls of naming Black things. If that which is white and unnamed is central, then it follows that that which is Black and named must, by definition, exist in some sort of peripheral or secondary space. Chambers' point is clear. So-called microaggressions keep minoritized artists, and art historians on the margins while buttressing whiteness's presence at the discipline's center. So again, it's remarkable that Michael Ray Charles, a retrospective, won the Eldredge Prize, and that my peers recognize its contribution to American art and history. The award demonstrates that art and art history continue to change and expand, even if in fits and starts. Michael Ray Charles, A Retrospective, is a book written from an insider's perspective. Charles and I were colleagues at UT for about a decade, and we are friends. That presents unique challenges and opportunities. In the opportunity column, I could interview the subject frequently. I had some knowledge of his practice and how he works. And I had heard about and sometimes seen objects that had not been published. Perhaps the most significant challenge was maintaining important boundaries regarding my own practice. I was upfront and clear. My own analyses about his work were distinct from his, and my own writing and writing practice were creative intellectual acts not unlike his painting practice. The book is a testament to our collegiality. The constellation of events in which I wrote the book is significant. For the few years leading up to the writing of the book, I taught the methods course in art history, an activity that newly sharpened my attention to the art historian's tools. At the same time, I was coming to terms with being the only art historian in a Black Studies department. I was realizing that while I shared a politics approach and praxis with many of my colleagues, we didn't necessarily share methodological tools. And personally, it was a deeply challenging time. My sister Mercedes was perishing from cancer and would eventually transition during the book's writing. Our father received a cancer diagnosis that year and was undergoing chemotherapy. I was making monthly trips to California to participate in his treatments, which fostered my father's engagement with the writing and with Charles's work. I regret that he too transitioned 2 months before the book's publication. He was not able to hold it in his hands. All of these experiences prompted me to reflect on art history, the bag of tricks it offers, and how I supplement its tools with others from Black studies and American studies. For me, the stakes are, one, being committed to close reading. That is, to engage deeply with the formal and material aspects of artworks as a way to highlight for readers why artists and their works matter. Two, writing with clarity for a non-specialist but interested reader. Three, creating absorbing social and intellectual histories of the recent past and to evaluate what can be gleaned from them. And four, last but not least, attending to power relations with an eye toward equity. The book is divided into 3 sections. The reader first encounters the artist, speaking in his own words via an interview. The next section, and I will ask you, Marvin, to please, trigger the video. The next section features colored plates of his works from graduate school until 2018, the most comprehensive collection of objects representing his career and major series within it. And go back to the slide, please. Finally, there is a study in Blackness and Black identity. A book within a book divided into sections. These sections are loosely grouped into biography, iconography, and sociocultural and intellectual histories. The painting SAAM encapsulates how Charles's artworks explore the ways in which familiarity, violence, storytelling, marketing, oppression, circulation, and socio-political ideology marry in objects and images that in years past were taken to be benign and indifferent cast-offs. Created in 1992, SAAM marks the beginning of Charles's mature work, when the artist embarked on the calculated appropriation of Americana to explore American culture and its racial history. It features a figure standing in profile, his face turning to meet the viewer. He wears a top hat and jacket, a large, brushy mass extends from his backside, and claws project from his feet. One might expect such a figure to solicit attention and smile engagingly. Instead, he appears reluctant and unsure of the position in which he finds himself. Viewers will no doubt recognize the image on which the painting is based. The original 1910 photograph by White Studios portrays the turn-of-the-century Bahamian American entertainer, Bert Williams, who was one of the last black-faced performers. The image from which Charles worked pictures the entertainer enacting the figure of Zip Coon, a 19th century minstrel character associated with the showiness of the cock. When Williams died in 1922, the tradition is said to have passed with him. Controversially, his act relied on blackface. He was one of a cadre of entertainers of African descent who, committed not to being outdone by white minstrels, donned the black mask to play characters then called darkies and coons, and I put those in air quotes. Williams was both loved and reviled. His success opened the doors for other African American performers at the same time that it contributed to consigning them to limited roles. His prominence occurred at a time when racial striving and empowerment coalesced around cultural nationalism. There was little room then for an African American artist to explore, let alone satirize, the hyperbolic figure of the black man that dwells in the American imagination. Yet in many ways, Williams was a forerunner to figures such as Michael Ray Charles, Robert Colescott, Spike Lee, and Kara Walker. He opened the door for late 20th century artists not just to parody the stereotypical narratives associated with African Americans, but also to explore the emotional turmoil that resulted from playing such roles. If the White Studio photograph portrays Williams with a Janus-like visage, one side dark, the other side darker, and hints at the dual nature of his identity as both an actor of African descent and as the enactor of stereotypes associated with African Americans, then Charles's painting also points to the idea of balancing two worlds, the black world and the white world, and for the figure appears to be part man, part bird, not fully all of one thing. Charles suggests the challenges African Americans face when taking on roles, professor, visual artist, and doctor among them, deemed beyond their stations. Not only do black strivers encounter derision and naysaying from inside and outside their ethnic group, but some are also expected to put on that mask and fight for acceptance, which only increases the psychic burden. The painterliness of Charles's brushstrokes adds to the emotional tenor of the work. Indeed, the sketchy quality of his mark-making undercuts the rooster's proud bearing and counters its star's narrative. In the passages I've just read, you've heard me look carefully at and read closely the artwork, even as I'm providing social historical context. In that way, I'm demonstrating respect for the work as art, drawing attention to the intellect and agency of its artist. Artist Charles Gaines's exhibition and catalog, The Theater of Refusal, and I'm showing you images of each here, teach us that minoritized artists, rather than their artworks, often become the objects of analysis for white critics. Keeping those problems front and center in my mind and in my writing, I performed a discursive analysis of the tropes with which critics framed Charles in his early career, rather than writing a traditional biography. Here's an example. Michael Ray Charles is no more the typical up-and-coming artist than he is the stereotypical young black male, wrote the 1997 Texas Monthly Profile. Exquisitely paradoxical, they would go on to say. The phrases up-and-coming artist, young black male, professor, family man, from the South, and paradoxical are just a few of the stereotypical boxes into which journalists have attempted to put Charles. Some of the categories, such as professor and family man, might fit together, but when the fact of Charles's blackness is added to the mix, the same categories, family man and professor, for example, seem diametrically opposed, unimaginable, aberrant. Certainly, Charles is remarkable in that he fits many of those classifications at the same time that he undermines them. More to the point, Charles's resistance to pigeonholing speaks volumes, notwithstanding his caginess regarding journalists and their limited imagination for black masculinities. I wrote, journalists were at pains to account for the artist's scholarly pursuits and disposition in efforts to emphasize how Charles broke the stereotypical molds of artist and black man. For instance, in the Houston Post, the journalist describes him as earnest, responsible, and almost painfully modest. In another piece, the International Review of African American Art notes that Charles's appearance is that of a clean-cut, conservatively dressed, and soft-spoken history teacher. Likewise, Texas Monthly calls Charles precociously settled down, a young man who teaches 2 days a week as an assistant professor at the University of Texas. In the PBS series Art 21, the theme of the artist-professor is also perpetuated, for books are shown to play as important a role in defining Charles's character as does painting. For example, in one shot, the camera carefully pans across his book-lined shelves where the Menil collections, the Image of the Black and Western Art, volumes 1, 2, and 4, stand beside a bound collection of Punch, the 19th century picture magazine, which leans against monographs of Claude Monet and Vincent van Gogh. Even as Charles was portrayed as having a professorial demeanor and talking in a soft monotone voice, the press painted him as the angry black man, surly and uncooperative. For instance, the Houston Press wags its finger, noting that he would not agree to a sit-down interview, though he did chat on the phone for a few minutes, and that he comes across as too harried to be generous with his audience. The article reveals that Charles admitted to starting off mad about the imagery, but that he put away his anger he put his anger into his artwork. Similarly, another article describes Charles as disturbed that some people cannot grasp the symbolic intent of his work and focus solely on the surface meaning. In fact, Charles expresses frustration that some viewers could not distinguish that a representation is different from a person, recalling, quote, "A journalist walked up to me once and said, 'So, tell me about the black woman in this painting.' I responded by saying, 'It's not a black woman, it's an image I use to refer to a black woman.' I don't think she was able to separate the caricature image of a black person from the reality of knowing what a black person actually is." A study of icons is one of the most powerful art history tools I used in writing Michael Ray Charles, a retrospective. Icons are symbols that carry with them stories. In Charles's case, he's interested in how and when certain icons and their associated narratives cohered and codified. He's also concerned with overloading icons so that their constructedness and fallacy become apparent. My section titled Stereotypes and Iconography, from which I'll read now, gives a sense of how I considered Charles's iconography, which incorporates a study of power relations. Sean Thornton gave his fellow graduate student, Michael Ray Charles, an object That would be the key to unlocking a new style and subject matter for the artist. Charles recalls that Thornton said he thought it could be useful for Charles. After looking at it briefly, he threw it into the corner of his studio, only to forget about it. At that moment in his graduate studies, Charles was producing figurative paintings that his professors deemed to be out of step with current stylistic trends. Some months later, railing against his professor's criticism and grappling with a style that felt authentic to his experiences, Charles happened across the plastic figure and began to study it. Composed of a plastic material, the waxy black figure tops out at about 5 inches tall. It bends at the knees in a seated position, hands resting on top of thighs. The figure's unnatural face appears more simian than human, its eyes and mouth open wide to form O's. The black pigment has flaked in areas, revealing a white understructure at the mouth and the right eye. Turning it over, one sees that the figure's ass is bared. Only at that point does it become clear. The figure was designed to depict someone who, interrupted while using the toilet, gives an exaggerated expression of surprise. In Charles's recollection, the mask-like face of the figure was a revelation, precisely because of its lack of realism. Proudly manufactured in the USA is one of the first works the artist produced in response to the plastic figure. The heavily shaded drawing depicts a factory assembly line with a representation of the plastic figure in the foreground, standing atop a baby pram and floating along on a conveyor belt. The drawing suggests 3 significant directions the artist would eventually head. 1, proudly manufactured, displays the act of appropriation. Charles found a ready-made object from popular culture, altered it for his uses, and deployed it in different contexts, thereby complicating its meaning. 2, the drawing demonstrates the artist's meditation on how stereotypical meanings are manufactured. 3, the work with its dark shading manifests Charles's formal reflection on the color black and discursive contemplation of black identity. If proudly manufactured imagines a factory where such hyperbolic representations of African Americans are produced, then Charles would become the factory himself. Eventually, Charles would deconstruct visual aspects of the plastic figure and deploy them in different settings. For instance, the black figure is depicted in its entirety and proudly manufactured in the USA. Whitewash and tar baby. The black mask, separated from the body, appears in Cream of the Crop, Be Think, Truly His Story, and The Whitey in You, among others. In SAAM, the mask is pictured white and has been conjoined to a different body. In Be Think, the visage barely registers as such. And in Truly His Story, the face conveys curiosity. The mask in SAAM, by contrast, reveals deep melancholy. Crucially, the mask communicates different sentiments depending on the context. During this period, Charles lands on appropriation, in particular, the appropriation of popular iconography, archetypes, and stereotypes associated with people of African descent. The widespread yet various distribution of the deconstructed pieces of icons allowed Charles to recognize how meaning shifts according to environment and to unpack stereotypes stealthily. Charles is especially interested in the stereotypes that are associated with Black people, distilled and deployed in contemptible collectibles, among other venues, and how they participate in maintaining the hierarchies that are part and parcel of American art, culture, and society. Whether in moving images, print advertisements, or consumer goods, exaggerated images and their associated narratives have been so thoroughly woven into the fabric of American society that it's no wonder that these icons are continually considered by artists. Charles is not unique in his use of the materials. Rather, he follows in a long line of artists and thinkers who have engaged stereotypical iconography in order to understand, transform, or resist them. To use Christina Sharp's phrase, they have exercised them in order to exorcise them. The manner in which the images and their attendant narratives circulate through and permeate American culture makes them deeply attractive to Charles and other artists, including but not limited to Betty Saar, Jeff Donaldson, Kara Walker, Fred Wilson, and Carrie Mae Weems. One of Charles's most compelling investigations of stereotypes and the locus of power behind them, "You think, therefore I am," makes the link of the imaginary to the actual and exaggerated ideas to physical instantiation. With its 3 circles of blue and yellow, the painting takes the form of an old poster bill for a circus or play. The faces of what appear to be blackface clowns are superimposed on the blue and yellow medallions. The figures' mouths are open very widely and pulled into tight smiles. Each mouth clenches its teeth, part of a banner with text that reads, "You think, therefore I am." Charles riffs on Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," which famously is taken to mean that one's humanity rests in one's ability to think and reason. Rarely do people consider that for Descartes, writing in the 17th century, humanity would have been narrowly defined, excluding all who were not educated, moneyed, and landed European men. Charles doubles down on the notion of exclusive authority, what we now call white privilege, which Descartes, and later his Enlightenment colleagues, invested solely in the male gentry. White people are responsible for establishing uneven power relations and conjuring the specter of the stereotype of the black person that haunts Western culture. Beyond the black and white binary that has framed ethno-racial relations in the United States, the painting also alludes to the matter of self-definition. An other is needed to define oneself, to differentiate oneself as separate from another person. Self-definition is distinct from xenophobia or the fear of the other, while xenophobia is a human response and not a uniquely American construct. The challenge becomes how to divorce the understanding of difference from the drive to oppress others because of said difference. This and other of Charles's works use a biting humor to consider why difference often leads to discrimination. Next, I'll read passages that explore Charles's formal strategies, including appropriation and the monochrome, as well as his engagements with aspects of Black studies. In the book, I trace how the artist's participation in the Warfield Center for African and African American Studies at UT, his relationship to its leaders, Drs. Omi Jones and Ted Gordon, and his participation in the creation of the Department of the African and African Diaspora Studies of that department, had a profound effect on his work. At Black Studies at UT, one's Blackness is not based on skin color, national origin, or cultural affiliation, but on a commitment to Black people and their liberation. Black Studies engendered in Charles a more intentional relationship to Black culture and representation, as well as a more nuanced understanding of Black identities, underscored by frequent sojourns outside the United States, during which the artist deepened his understanding of xenophobia, his sensitivity to the position of people of African descent in other countries, and his awareness of how class and anti-Black racism intersect to oppress Black people. This passage reflects how I combine the attention to formal strategies central among art history's tools with historiographical description of Charles's engagements with the field of Black studies. Charles's work, Black is Black, reflects on what constitutes African American identity and on the limits of Black excellence and power. The painting portrays President Barack Obama and Charles renders the figure in different values of black. It points to the reality that neither black nor African American identity is monolithic. Produced using black or other darkly pigmented acrylic paint, Black is Black, like other monochromatic or single color artworks in black, is exceedingly difficult to register. Viewers must shift their viewpoints high to low, side to side, in order to make out the subject. Indeed, the painting's subject matter might appear to be hidden in plain sight. Nonetheless, viewers will recognize that Charles's image of Obama is based on the official presidential photographic portrait created by Pete Souza. The title refers to a line from the song Me, Myself, and I by De La Soul, in which guest artist Q-Tip raps the lyric Black is Black as a way to dismiss interracial discrimination and colorism within the African American community. The title also riffs on the fact that while Obama is the biracial son of a white mother, all certain people see is his blackness. It follows then that his blackness renders Obama invisible to these populations. By 2015, when the painting was created, Obama had been highly effective in some areas of his presidency and dramatically ineffectual in others. While commentators assign some blame on the increasingly bipartisan and ideological separation within the ranks of the national government, the fact of Obama's blackness played a significant role, and one that is both palpable and difficult to pinpoint. In this respect, it didn't matter that Obama's father was Kenyan, nor that he was the mixed-race child of a white mother. That he is black rendered him not just the object of extreme anti-black racial hatred, but also a potent target of jealousy because of his by-the-bootstraps achievements in education and his attainment of power and wealth. To be sure, if Obama had two Euro-American parents, his meritocratic rise would be regarded as a textbook example of the American dream. Simply put, many lawmakers refused to support the Obama administration's policies because he and a significant number of his aides were black. Charles's sampling or remixing of other artworks suggests the significant role humor plays in his work. Humor is powerful precisely because it constitutes a like-minded community who bond over shared knowledge and experiences. In the case of Black is Black, by referencing De La Soul, Charles nods his head to fans of hip-hop. Sampling a lyric from De La Soul's song Me, Myself, and I, which on its surface seems composed of funny and nonsensical lyrics, but in fact advocates respect for the multiplicity that is Black culture and people. And I'm going to quote here. Proud I'm proud of what I am. Poems I speak are plug to type. Please, oh please, let plug to be himself, not what you read or write. Even while Charles points to an inclusive model of Black consciousness, he paints the former community organizer in hues so dark that the figure is all but occluded. The work hints at the satire that is a hallmark of Charles's dark humor. No matter that Obama's features are exaggerated, white people will not bother to look closely at him anyway. The Black is Black is a monochromatic painting gestures to some of Charles's formal preoccupations, the rendering of Black figures, the use of Black materials, and their incommensurability. In Black is Black, the artist uses black, dark grays, and a touch of green to depict Obama. And while the figure is distinguished from the ground, it is not necessarily because of a change in color, but a difference in sheen and texture. Here, Charles explores the formal problem of delineating figure from ground at the same time that he examines the problem of representing Black people. This blurring of figure and ground becomes a metaphor for the inability to distinguish real people from the exaggerated caricatures that constitute stereotypes on the part of many Americans. Like many artists, Charles is a student of art history with a Catholic interest in art and visual culture. To unpack his engagement with past artworks, I constructed a historiography of pop art and appropriation and considered Charles's relationship to it. In the following passages, I suggest that the artist's use of historical works is both a long-standing and common practice among artists, as well as a Black studies tool. Such appropriations, I argue, simultaneously demonstrate Charles's knowledge of art histories, express his agency in using other artists' works to his own ends, conveys power to subvert original meanings and assign new ones, and assert his belonging within the art historical canon. In his reuse of iconographies and engagement with banal, mass-produced, and some might say ugly images, Charles's art has considerable overlap with pop art. Likewise, his interest in Americana, particularly advertising conventions and consumer culture, mirrors that of pop artists. In 1963, art historian Alan Solomon describes in his essay, The New Art, what he found to be the outlines of what was then a relatively new form. He credits Robert Rauschenberg with bringing found and low objects to his work, Jasper Johns with employing well-known images such as the American flag to focus on form and materiality, and Alan Capro with bringing the outside world to artistic production. Solomon nods his head to Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, who adapted the scale of objects and images, and Klaus Oldenburg and Jim Dine with adjusting color and texture. Charles puts these valuable formal lessons to good use in his work, often adjusting the scale of his found objects and distressing them to add an antiqued, fusty quality. Charles has found the cloak and hood among the powerful icons he returns to often. Charles began to employ them in his art beginning in the early 2000s in the post-9/11 United States, whose citizens were encouraged to fear Muslims and halt immigration. Since the early aughts, the country, and indeed the Western world, has witnessed the growth of a populist nativism coupled with ethnic nationalism, resulting in the rise of the so-called alt-right and the increased visibility of white supremacist organizations. In this context, the white mask and hood deserve renewed scrutiny. In the rally, Charles pictures a single Black figure against a ground of white hoods to explore the notion of intra-racism and hiding in plain sight. With blood-red lips and red eyes, the figure turns its head away from the hoods to peer directly at the viewer, flashing a sinister grin. The painting's limited grisaille palette and subject matter lend it an ominous feeling. Charles has used the symbols to explore narratives of white supremacy, just as artists Philip Guston, Vincent Valdez, Tammy Rubin, Arnold Kemp, and Derek Bossier have. While the Ku Klux Klan organization took its inspiration from Protestant religious garb, other such penitential garments comprised of a cape and a conically shaped hood or capirote are worn by Catholics in Spain during the Holy Week. The cloak and hood intrigued Charles because of the various narratives, white supremacist and spiritual among them, attached to them. Similar cloaked figures can be found in untitled drawings in which Charles pictures a lone Black figure peeking out from behind a conical hood among many, and draws a visual analogy between the hood and a shark's nose, respectively. In the large-scale sculpture Three Graces, whose pillars look strikingly like members of a Klan rally sheathed in white robes and hoods, Charles took up the firebrand symbols at a precipitous time. A year into the Obama presidency, when fears of a possible assassination attempt on the first African-American president ran high, and Euro-American ethnic pride was fomenting. The work is composed of three objects that look very much like tall and imposing rifle bullets. Because each matte silver cylinder is topped by a shiny cone complete with two dark ovals that mimic eyes, the objects also reference human bodies. Moreover, just as Lichtenstein took on Fernand Léger in his artist studio, Three Graces references other artworks by the likes of Canova, Botticelli, Raphael, and Rubens, among others. In that way, Charles employs a set of images that recur in his oeuvre to conjure, as does the work's title, the Three Graces or Charities. The daughters of Zeus, they were beauty, charm, and creativity incarnate. Charles transforms the myth and retools the graces, cloaking them in silver shells and imagining them as deadly. In appropriating a theme popular with European masters, Charles demonstrates not just an open-minded and wide-reaching interest in the history of art, but also a willingness to take on hallowed classics. Pop artists deployed icons of Americana to pessimistic effects. Charles's adaptations of American icons convey ennui, too, for a society racked with social, economic, and political inequality, including but not limited to injustice, police violence against people of color, and mass incarceration that targets minorities. In the context of pop, Sidra Stitch suggests that repeated use, quote, not only compels a re-looking at a known icon, but also transforms that icon into a paradoxical entity. The well-defined symbol becomes an intriguing complex of contradictory impulses, end quote. In the book, I show that a similar argument can be made about Charles and his use of stereotypical imagery. Michael Ray Charles' A Retrospective is an art history that considers where the rubber hits the road. It considers how an artist makes work that calls us toward material change while working on an unequal playing field, and in a discipline whose raison d'etre is to categorize, discriminate, and hold up what has already been deemed valuable. This book and the practices it describes and exemplifies offer an art history that understands that visual culture and art are serious, constructed products that wield power, that contest and enforce hierarchies, that challenge censorship, that endeavor toward equity. What is perhaps most instructive about the book Michael Ray Charles, A Retrospective, is that it offers a model of a relevant art history, one that teaches us to think critically about our media-rich environment and to act toward equity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cherise. I'm looking forward to the discussion with our live audience. The Getty Research Institute Scholars Program and Getty AV team is graciously hosting the live recording of this event, and consequently the Q&A period will include that audience as well as those joining us from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I encourage the virtual audience to use the chat feature or the raise your hand icon, which is in the reactions menu, to ask our speaker a question. When your turn comes, if you would like to ask your question live, you may turn on your camera and mic to do so. For our in-person audience, please go to the microphone. I will be alerted and then invite you to ask your question. All right, do we have some questions? Yes, hello. Okay, please unmute yourself. I don't see your name on the square. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Jillian. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for that very rich intervention, really, that you're doing with this entire project, and even the way that you have presented this lecture. And those of us doing interdisciplinary work at the intersections of critical race studies, gender studies, and art history really your opening pass for us. So thank you first for that. One thing I really appreciated about your talk is the way that it really highlights how Black studies fused with art history can give us a lot of really rich insights on the intersections of ontology and representation. And I'm thinking, I don't have as much as a question as an invitation. I would love to hear your thinking on where you're going with these methods that you innovate in this book in your next project. It seems like in Michael Ray Charles's work, we're confronting a lot of history around particular forms of racial trauma and racial pain, and your next project is on healing. And I'm just interested in, like, does that shift to consider questions of healing, does that shift necessitate a sort of adjustment to these methods or different methods or feminist methods? So anyway, just an invitation to sort of hear where you're going next.
Thank you, Jillian. That's a great question. So some of you will know that Michael Ray Charles was initially going to be a chapter in the book that I'm writing now. Somehow it flipped orders, and Michael Ray Charles came first, but it is circling around some of the very same problems that my current book is thinking about, is focused on. And so those are appropriation, trauma, and whether one can really heal from and move on from a traumatic episode or painful event. And I would argue that no, you cannot move on from that kind of traumatic pain, and that is what I will be arguing in the book that is being written right now. But yeah, I mean, I think that there are lots of ways that Black studies offers really important interventions about thinking through belonging, citational strategy, something that Tiffany Barber and I have been talking through quite a bit in our time here, and what the kind of afterlives of trauma are. I mean, is it only kind of doom and gloom? I think it's not, but I think there are important strategies and maybe, and this goes back to both ontology and to psychoanalysis, that there are important strategies and compassion that we can learn through Black studies, among others, that I am absolutely thinking through in the current project. So that was kind of an all over the place answer, Jillian, but I'm kind of headed very squarely into the directions that you are pointing toward in your comment. Do you have a follow-up for me, Jillian? Because I know I'm the queen of follow-up questions.
No, thank you so much, and congratulations again on the book award. It's really exciting.
Thank you, Jillian. Jenny?
Yes, I'd like to add my thanks. And before we take the next question, which I believe is from Kristen Buick, I just need to remind everybody that the program is being recorded, and by appearing on video, you're agreeing to your likeness and voice being part of the recorded program, which will be shared on SAAM's website and YouTube channel. For our virtual audience, please note policies in the chat. Thanks so much. Okay, so we have a question. How does this book relate to your first, Enacting Others? Also, I don't think you can see this, but you're having lots of praise, and Kristen adds, I was having an amen chorus while watching. Oh,
so I think that was Kristen you said, right? Kirsten Buick that asked that question. Yeah, thank you. So Enacting Others was my first book, comes out of the dissertation, and it is thinking through how artists change their racial designation in performance art to explore racial formation and to think through stereotypes of race, of gender, and class, among others. And so Michael Ray Charles, especially in his interest in minstrelsy and other performative traditions, and also in thinking through how all of us are always performing various identities, is really right in line with enacting others. And so what Michael Ray Charles's book does, what the book does, is also kind of allow me to use performance studies tools that I learned from colleagues in this room and from Harry Elam back in the day at Stanford. Thanks, Kirsten.
We have an in-person question at the Getty.
Oh, wow. That's kind of amazing that you can see us. I'm a little freaked out by that. Hi, Robin. Thank you, Cherise, for this really amazing talk that I think was incredibly honest and rich and blunt and straightforward in forecasting and showcasing the problems of the field of art history and issues of lack of representation. And I think that this talk is going to become a classic thing that I will assign, and I'm sure other people will too, because I think it's a really important rendition of how to accept a prize with grace and also criticality. So thank you for that. I actually wanted to ask a question specifically about because we're a kind of combo audience here, and one doesn't get to be around a lot of Americanists on site here at the Getty, a kind of Americanist question about Texas in particular. And I'm wondering about if you could sort of talk about Texas as a site of Blackness, not just Southern Blackness, but also the intersection of sort of Texas as a kind of site of nativism and kind of independence and histories of really problematic intersectional oppressions. And also at the moment in which Texas is leading the charge against critical race theory and what it means to produce this work at a public university, and also for Charles to go from a public system where I don't know the composition of that campus at UT, but I did teach at University of Houston, and Charles and I did not overlap, unfortunately, but Houston is a city with a rich African-American culture. It's a university that has a huge Black population, and it's also a campus that is structured by its own historic redlining. And so I'm wondering, could you just talk maybe about Texas as a site for the production of your work and his?
Yeah, thank you for that rich question, Jenny. So UT has somewhere around 4% of a Black population in undergraduate. I think it might be lower than that for graduate students. So that is the context in which he was teaching at the University of Texas. And yes, Houston has a much larger, richer Black population, University of Houston, I mean, and the city of Houston as well. You know, it's a great question, and it's something that I talk about in the book. There are two sections in the book, one that is dealing specifically with Charles being in Texas and at the University of Texas in Central Texas. And just as a reminder, he becomes assistant professor at the University of Texas around the time that James Byrd is dragged through Jasper, Texas, which is in East Texas, for example. He is on the tenure track during the Hopwood decision, which was a Supreme Court case that was against affirmative action at the law school at UT. So there are really major, as there are now, major national events that are happening in Texas that will go on to affect the rest of the country, in which he is on the tenure track at that time. Now, the other thing that I talked about in the book, which I am really proud of, I will say, is thinking through what it means to be a citizen of the Third Coast, of the Gulf Coast, not on the East Coast, not on the West Coast, and One, what it means to be from Louisiana and then in Houston for all the years that he was there, and what that's also meant for his career to be away from major centers of art production. And so one of the things that I'm really pleased with, and I'm just going to smile for myself here, is that I think about what water means to him. And water, if you are a Gulf Coast resident, means a particular thing, and you live there, Jenny, so you know it means a different thing. And so, there's the repetition of the image of water throughout his work, and I struggled for a long time thinking, how do I deal with this? And then it occurred to me, well, this is kind of about hurricanes, and this is about flooding. So that's the part that I'm pleased with, that I think through floods that happened in Lake Charles, where he went to college, floods that happened where he grew up, and also in Houston. And remarkably, he and his family were stuck in Houston during, and I can't remember that most recent, Harvey? Was that the hurricane? Hurricane Harvey? Yeah. That he and his family were forced to evacuate and were stuck in Houston during Harvey, and finally evacuated to Austin. And, water rose up to, I don't know how high, but the whole bottom floor of his house had to be remade. So water and place figure in those ways in the book. And then the other thing that I try to do is to think of his work in relation to the South also. So Louisiana, Texas, but also the larger idea of the South and what it means in relation to the rest of the country, but also, again, what it means to have stayed in the South throughout his career rather than going to other art centers on coasts.
We have a question from Maida Duiwa Jones. Please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Actually, my question follows up on something that you just said, Cherise, or shall I say, Dr. Smith. I'm so grateful you mentioned. The thing I love about the book is how nuanced you are in the discussion of regionalisms in that regionalism section on Charles. And my question is actually about a relationship between regionalism, visibility, and celebrity. I was curious about when you were doing that reading, both in the book, but then also differently anew in your talk, about the Black is Black Ain't, which was such a beautiful close reading and viewing that you did and showing that you did for us. I was wondering when you talked about kind of his use of paint and a different kind of, not just the layers of it, but also the way that his use of paint makes him, Charles gives us a statement about the lack of a monolithic Blackness, right? And then the monochromatic element of a non-monolithic Blackness. Would you be interested in talking about the relationship between celebrity and iconographic registers in Charles's work, and how that registers for you in your current book project? Because it just struck me as a very interesting thing to wash out or to make a highly visible figure like the former President Obama not completely invisible. So it's not Invisible Man, like if you think of, Elizabeth Catlett's sculpture, where kind of literally it's a cutout, right? So it's not that kind of washing out, but it's something different that I'm still trying to understand in that work. And I'm not sure about that relationship between what is Charles doing with iconographic representations within the art historical canon versus celebrity iconographic representations within the politics and the political realm of visual culture. But I know you're the person who's most equipped to answer that question for me. So thank you so much for this talk and for your book and for your work.
Thank you, Meta. So, I think what's interesting about monochromes, I kind of have a back burner project on monochromes right now. Some of you know, they fascinate me. I'm interested in why Black artists in particular use monochrome, and Black monochromes at that. I think that, formally it's a super challenging way to work, but also for artists of African descent, it's also a way to kind of meditate on belonging and on how we Black people call ourselves. We, of course, are not Black. We do not have Black skin, but is a term that we use to refer to ourselves. And so I think that it's a really rich avenue of exploration, especially in his work, and one that he has continued. He has a show up in Paris right now, and that show is almost exclusively in grisaille or in Blacks. And so I think with the Obama painting, it really forces you to look carefully at the painting. And that is something that all of us need to do, to slow down and look carefully at art and how it is constructed and how it's made. And so there's that part of the Black is Black painting, but then there is the racial dynamics that I went over, that on the one hand, he was too Black for some white voters, he wasn't Black enough for some Black voters, and this really challenging position that he has been forced to occupy because of his own racial identity as not the child of a Black American son, but of an African man and a white woman. So that kind of excludes him from traditional notions of American Blackness, which adds these really interesting complications. Thanks, Meta.
That's great. I was reminded of the final paragraph of the book. It's just very notable how you say Charles' work is not so easy. For inattentive viewers, the works render themselves to cursory, shallow, and pat ratings, but careful viewers who take their time are amply rewarded. I feel like you show, and not just I feel like, you show the reader how to do that. You demonstrate it for us. And I also see that there's that parallel with the critique that Charles is making in the painting, Black and Black. It's so skillful. And the layering just works so well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question live in your room? I'm not seeing one.
Yeah,
Jenny.
Can I ask a follow-up to my original question? You mentioned the term Third Coast, which is a thing of great pride in Texas, Louisiana, and the Gulf Coast region. I'm wondering if you could, I guess, this is kind of an inarticulate question, but the problem of regionalism has been a terminology used to dismiss American art wholesale, like the entire field. Yeah. And it's a term that you embrace in your book. It's a term that Third Coast is also a form of embrace. And I guess I'm wondering, could you make a pronouncement or diagnosis maybe about the field of American art as a whole? Is regionalism and sort of the reassertion or the embrace of that term, which was previously an epithet, could that be utilized the same way queer has been re-embraced, or different kinds of epithets redeployed? And is regionalism going that direction, or how do you feel about that term in relation to your work and the field at large?
So I don't want to speak for all of American art, but I will say that I think it's a super useful term, and it's one that I am employing regularly and doing another regional project. I'm doing a project, the one that I just mentioned, that is about California conceptual practices and how different art schools and art centers in Southern California basically develop their own conceptualist practices, which I know you're also interested in. And so, what does a place like California give to Black people who are maybe from here first or second generation, but whose families have come from the South, right, and from the Jim Crow South? So to think through what a unique geographical place and its and even its geographies, right? I mean, the sprawl of Southern California, for example, is something that I'm realizing as part of this project. How those real geographies and special qualities of a place imbricate themselves into the work of artists, I think is really important. So I did, appropriate regionalism for positive effects and not for negative effects, but also to kind of turn it on its head. It's not a region that we think about, right? We've thought about other regions in regionalism, but not a Gulf Coast one. But having said that, if you think about Valerie's show on the South, the name of which is out of my head right now. Yeah, the Dirty South, thank you. Of course, the Dirty South. It's a thing. It's a thing we need to think about, not just as an imaginary, but also as a place where people actually live and are making their ways.
Would it be okay if I ask a question?
Sure, Robin.
So I very much appreciated in the book and also in your talk how you're connecting Charles' critique of racial performance to the experience of navigating place, and in particular the systemic racism of academia, and that you're talking about his experience and your own experience in those institutional settings as well. Methodologically, I know this diverges from the convention of scholars maintaining or feigning disinterest or distance from their subjects. And I'm wondering how this methodological move of bringing yourself into the text changes how the text operates, or changes the relationship between the author and the reader.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was one that I just had to work out as I wrote, but I knew that because I was there for some of the history that I was telling, I needed to acknowledge being there and my own experiences. So one of the things that I acknowledge in the book is that Charles was on the hiring committee that hired me as an assistant professor onto the UT campus. And also that I am an affiliate of Black Studies, and that it was the Black Studies Center that gave my line to Black Studies for there to be an African Americanist in art history in the first place. So I felt like it was important to disclose what some people might have thought of as a conflict of interest, but also to be, honest about my relationship to Charles and to the institution that I was talking about. And my hope is that the next project talks even more about my own kind of embeddedness within in the studies that I am doing and why I do it in the first place.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate how it came out in the interview component as well.
Thank you. We've got an in-person question.
Thank you.
Dr. Smith, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing work. I wondered if you might touch on the personal difficulties in writing about an artist, not only who you know, but whose work you know so well, and how you retained the integrity of your writing, and what those interviews with Michael Ray might have been like.
Oh, thank you. Good question. So those of you who know Michael Ray, and a few of you do, he is a talker, and he will go off in directions that have nothing to do with where you're headed, and then he will miraculously go back. So the interviews were long, and had to try to guide him to areas of interest, but also let him do his thing. And I think, one of the main challenges, and I mentioned this in the text, is that he, pretty much every month, so how's the writing going and can I read it? No, you cannot. I'm not sitting in the studio, telling you where to put that paint stroke, or telling you what the next painting should be. So you're not in my kitchen, which is where I wrote this book. You're not in my kitchen with me writing this book, and I'm not giving it over to you. It wasn't until the very end, until I had a very full draft that I sent to the press, that I sent him a copy, mostly for fact checking. And those of you who work on contemporary will know the artist's ego. And one of his main criticisms was, wait a second, when you're talking about my work and Kara Walker's work at the same time, you should put my name first and not Kara Walker's name first. And I, of course, didn't do that. I switched it up because that is what a writer does, right? And so there were lots of instances like that where, kind of firm boundaries needed to be drawn, and also to, basically explain the different practices that artists have versus writers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Not seeing another question, but I'm wondering if you will indulge me. I have one that is kind of for all the professors out there. So Charles' use of racist imagery diverges from the work of artists like Betty Saar. I'm thinking of Liberation at Jemima, which, if Saar's work seems to transform a racial stereotype into an empowered icon, Charles has, I believe you call it, a pessimistic realism. And I'm wondering how in the classroom you might use images together to convey that difference to students and other viewers who might otherwise just sort of gloss over seeing the icon and not seeing the fullness of the presentation done by each artist and what it means.
Yeah, I think that a Saar image and a Charles image, and probably even a Walker image, would be really useful and productive juxtapositions, because they are so different in their formal styles and in the ways in which they engage with the iconography. So that would be useful. But then the ways that they kind of redeploy them are also really different. I mean, I think that with Walker, it's really about kind of psychological terror, and even a fictionalized fabulation of a nightmare setting. I think that Saar, on the other hand, is thinking through empowerment and how to turn things on their head to argue for more power and more agency. And Charles, I think, is probably somewhere in between. On the one hand, he is interested in the kind of psychological turmoil or psychic weight of these images and what it feels like to be burdened by them. But he's also, I think, much more of a trickster. I mean, I think you can also say that he probably has a stronger sense of humor than the other two artists do. So those are productive ways to think through different uses. Looks like there's maybe an in-person question.
Yes, thank you so much. Oops. Thank you so much for your talk. I've really appreciated the chance to hear you work through your scholarship with us. And
Thank you.
to set it into all these different contexts that you've shared with us in particular today, from different subfields within art history to allied disciplines to visual culture at large. So thank you.
Thanks.
Very much for that. I've been thinking through a question, and I think your response to the last one may have kind of created a bridge for me. I'm struck by the interconnection in Charles's work between the past and the present and how mutually informed they are, and how his work really creates an opportunity or a necessity for viewers to just stop and think about that interrelation of images across time and space. And it makes me wonder if he has an openness either in his images or in your interviews with him towards the future. Does he open up opportunities for us to think about representational possibilities moving forward?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know that there's a future-mindedness that he has in terms of how these kinds of icons and stereotypes might be dismantled for good, for example. But he is really interested right now in the figure of the alligator and or crocodile, and I showed you some of the works from his collection that deal with those figures, and you know, oftentimes they are alligators that are, you know, kind of after the genitals of a male, for example, right? And so he is finding those in films and is using those in new works. So yeah, I don't know that I have a future-mindedness answer among his current work, but I will say that I think it was in 2020 he had an exhibition in Austin, and he made this just amazing, probably 20 by 22 foot tall, 10 foot wide painting that was mostly monochromatic of a slaving ship, and the kind of sails, sorry, AV people, the sails where there might have been wind kind of billowing through them were watermelon smiles. And so that's a way that we're kind of glimpsing at a new set of iconographies and, you know, where he might be headed next. But, you know, to work big like that is something. And he's not doing a whole lot of big stuff, but he should continue to do big stuff. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cherise, before we close up, would you like to say something about your new project, your current project?
It looks like there's one in-person question from Tobias.
Sorry,
Okay.
one question.
No.
Thank you for this wonderful talk and congratulations on the book prize. One thing that was really striking to me was the extent to which it seems like Michael Ray Charles is really engaging with the icon and the stereotype. That seems to be the source material. And the one moment, and this is kind of related in some ways to Meta Jones's question, there are two moments, it seems like, where he's actually glossing an actual person, the Burt Williams image and the Obama image. Yeah. And I'm wondering whether you think of those two examples as somehow different, where there's actually an actual black referent or an actual person, as opposed to the image itself that is so detached from actual black people.
Oh, super interesting question, Tobias. Thank you. Yeah. It's true. I mean, there's really, in all of the works that I've seen, so there's also images of Elvis. And those do look completely different from these. So that's an important thing to think about. Wow. Thank you. I'm going to have to think more about that. But I really like that question because it it's a useful way of thinking through just how detached his images are from actual Black people, because there are the two instances of images based on actual people that he makes. And they're very, very different, right? I mean, I think that SAAM is one of my favorite works of his, and you can see why. It's just so expressive in how he paints it, and so thoughtful in his use of the Burt Williams image and in how we all perform identities and the psychic weight of that. But it's a really, I think, well-constructed and thoughtful work that is thinking on so many different and acting on so many different levels at the same time, in the same way that Black is Black is. So yeah, I mean, there might be a different depth, and I don't mean a depth of field, but a depth in thinking that we might attach to works like Black is Black and SAAM, whereas the others are more about surface and about flat ideas about Black people. Yeah, that's a great question, Tobias. Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing how you answer that question. It's fascinating. Really good.
I think we have one more question.
Yes. One question is, how many pieces of art of his do you own? And the second question is, what's the high range of some of his paintings that have been sold?
I do own a work by Charles, it is true, and that was a gift by the artist, a portfolio that Black Studies made with him as a kind of fundraising opportunity for the department. And I think that his work is in, if it's selling at auction, it's about $100,000. That is what I've seen on Artsy and other, what's the word? Other kind of value-driven websites that show the results of auctions. So that's what one can expect to pay if one is trying to get a Michael Ray Charles work at auction. Robin, I'm not sure I want to talk about the new project because I think you gave a nice introduction to it in the introduction, and I've talked a little bit about how it's on California-based conceptualism here.
Thank you. And thank you all for the questions today. I'd like to especially express thanks to the Getty Research Institute Scholars Program and Getty AV team for hosting the recording of this event. Thank you to all of you who attended the Smithsonian American Art Museum's 33rd Annual Charles C. Eldredge Prize Lecture. Thank you also to our museum director, Stephanie Stebish, and most of all, thank you to our speaker, the winner of the 33rd Annual Eldredge Prize, Cherise Smith. I'm looking forward to seeing you all.